EP1, Part 1. Most people don't notice when their life starts shrinking. There is no moment that marks it clearly. No collapse, no warning, no single mistake that can be pointed to and explained later. Life doesn't fall apart. It simply becomes smaller. At first, nothing seems wrong. Days still arrive on time, responsibilities are met, routines work the way they always have. From the outside, everything appears stable, sometimes even successful. But slowly, quietly, the range of movement narrows. There are fewer spontaneous decisions, fewer moments where something unexpected feels welcome. The idea of change no longer feels exciting, it feels inefficient, not frightening, just unnecessary. And that is how it begins. Most people imagine decline as something dramatic, a visible failure, a crisis that forces attention. But real decline rarely announces itself that way. It feels more like settling, a subtle preference for what is known, a growing tolerance for sameness, a quiet agreement with repetition. Nothing hurts, nothing breaks, which is why it goes unnoticed. The mind adapts quickly to reduced space. What once felt limiting begins to feel familiar. What once felt temporary begins to feel permanent. And over time, the absence of choice no longer feels like loss. It feels like relief. There is comfort in knowing what tomorrow will look like. Comfort in removing uncertainty. Comfort in reducing the number of decisions that need to be made. Comfort is efficient. It lowers friction. It smooths the edges of daily life. It makes existence easier to manage. And for a while, that feels like progress. But comfort has a quiet side effect. It doesn't only remove discomfort, it removes awareness. When life becomes predictable, attention fades. When days repeat, curiosity weakens. When nothing demands adjustment, the mind stops scanning for possibility. This doesn't feel like stagnation, it feels like peace. And that is why it's so difficult to notice what is happening. Most people don't wake up one day and decide to live a smaller life. They simply stop resisting the narrowing. They stop asking certain questions. They stop exploring alternatives. They stop imagining themselves in different circumstances, not because they can't, but because they don't need to, at least not urgently. Urgency disappears first. Without urgency, movement slows. Without movement, range shrinks. And without range, life becomes easier to predict, but harder to expand. This process doesn't require failure. In fact, it often happens to people who are doing reasonably well, people who have learned how to make things work, people who value stability, people who are competent, responsible, reliable, people who solved the problem of survival and never noticed when growth quietly stepped aside. Routines begin as tools. They save energy, they reduce mental load, they create structure. But over time, routines stop serving choice and begin replacing it. What started as a way to move more freely becomes a way to move less. Decisions are no longer evaluated, they are inherited, not because someone forced them, but because they were there. And the longer something remains in place, the harder it feels to question it. Not logically, emotionally. Because questioning the structure of one's life introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty feels expensive. It asks for attention, it asks for effort, it asks for a willingness to feel slightly uncomfortable, and when life is already functioning, even imperfectly, that cost feels unnecessary. So the questions fade, not dramatically, quietly. They are postponed, then forgotten. And what remains is a life that functions but does not stretch. EP1, Part 2. Stability is often confused with stillness. From the outside, they look almost identical. Both appear calm, both appear controlled. Both suggest that nothing urgent needs attention. But internally, they feel very different. Stability has movement inside it. Stillness does not. A stable life can absorb change without collapsing. A still life avoids change because it cannot. The difference is subtle, and because it is subtle, it often goes unnoticed for years. Most people don't feel themselves becoming still. They feel themselves becoming efficient. They optimize routines. They remove friction. They reduce variability. At first, this feels intelligent. Fewer surprises mean fewer mistakes. Fewer options mean faster decisions. Less uncertainty means less anxiety. And for a while, it works. Life runs smoothly. Days feel manageable. Energy is conserved. But something else happens, quietly, in the background. When friction disappears, awareness weakens. When nothing challenges the structure of a life, the structure stops evolving. The mind begins to treat the current arrangement as permanent, not because it was chosen deliberately, but because it hasn't been questioned in a long time. This is not laziness. It is adaptation. Human beings are remarkably good at adapting to limitation. We normalize reduced space quickly. We adjust expectations downward without noticing. We stop reaching not because we are incapable, but because reaching no longer feels necessary. And necessity is a powerful force. When necessity fades, movement becomes optional. When movement becomes optional, it is often postponed, and postponed movement has a way of disappearing entirely. Nothing announces the shift. There is no internal alarm that sounds when curiosity drops, no signal when imagination narrows, no warning when tolerance for uncertainty declines. It all happens below the threshold of urgency. Life does not feel worse. It simply feels quieter. Can be mistaken for peaceful, especially in a world that feels loud and demanding. There is relief in knowing what comes next, relief in having fewer decisions to make, relief in operating within familiar boundaries. Relief is seductive, but relief is not the same as freedom. Freedom requires space, and space requires a willingness to tolerate discomfort. Not dramatic discomfort, not suffering, just the mild, persistent unease of not knowing exactly how things will turn out. Stillness avoids that unease. It builds systems that function well enough to make questioning them feel unnecessary. It turns life into a series of repetitions that feel safe because they are known. And over time, the absence of disruption becomes a value. Not consciously, but emotionally. People begin to protect the shape of their lives without remembering why that shape was chosen in the first place. The structure becomes the priority, not the purpose. This is why change begins to feel expensive, not in money, in attention. Change asks for presence. It asks for reevaluation. It asks for the uncomfortable work of noticing what no longer fits. And noticing requires energy. When energy is limited by age, by responsibility, by routine, the mind looks for ways to conserve it. One of the easiest ways to conserve energy is to stop questioning. Not everything, just the big things. The direction of one's life, the assumptions that support it, the choices that were made long ago under different conditions. Those questions feel heavy, so they are set aside, not because the answers are dangerous, but because asking them feels tiring. And gradually, the absence of questioning becomes normal. Life continues to function. Bills are paid, obligations are met, social roles remain intact. From the outside, everything appears fine. but internally, something has stopped expanding. It is difficult to name this sensation. It doesn't feel like sadness. It doesn't feel like dissatisfaction. It doesn't feel like failure. It feels like a narrowing of possibility, as if certain paths have quietly closed without ceremony, as if certain versions of the self are no longer considered realistic, not because they were impossible, but because they were never revisited. Time has a way of making unexamined choices feel inevitable. The longer a life remains in one shape, the more that shape feels like destiny rather than design. People begin to say things like, "This is just how life is now." EP1, Part 3. One of the most dangerous aspects of a shrinking life is the absence of warning. There is no signal that says something essential is being lost, no clear discomfort that demands action, no visible breakdown that forces reflection. Instead, there is smoothness. Life continues without interruption. Systems keep working. Roles remain intact. And because nothing collapses, nothing feels urgent. Human attention is wired to respond to threat, not absence. We notice pain. We notice disruption. We notice loss when it is loud. But we rarely notice what slowly fades. Energy diminishes gradually. Curiosity softens. The impulse to explore weakens. Not enough to alarm, just enough to adjust. The mind is exceptionally good at compensating. When one area contracts, it reallocates focus elsewhere. When excitement fades, it replaces it with predictability. When possibility narrows, it substitutes control. Control feels reassuring. It creates the impression of mastery, even when growth has stalled. It offers clarity in exchange for range. And clarity is appealing, especially later in life, when ambiguity feels heavier than it once did. This is why shrinking often feels like maturity. People say things like, "I'm just more realistic now. I know what works for me. I don't need all that anymore." Sometimes that is true, but sometimes it is not realism, it is accommodation. Accommodation is subtle. It happens when the mind adjusts its expectations to match its current circumstances, rather than questioning whether those circumstances still fit. Over time, accommodation hardens into identity. I'm not that kind of person. I've never been good at that. That phase is over. These statements feel factual. They sound grounded. They carry the tone of acceptance. But often, they are conclusions reached without recent evidence. They are based on past versions of the self, operating under past conditions, with past energy levels and assumptions. Still, they feel true because they have not been challenged. The longer a belief goes untested, the more it feels permanent. This is how lives become smaller without feeling constrained. Boundaries are internalized before they are examined. People do not feel trapped, they feel settled. And settlement can be deeply misleading. Settlement suggests that something has been resolved, that the searching phase is complete, that the answers are known. But many of these answers were formed under pressure to stabilize, to provide, to endure. They were practical answers, necessary answers. What often goes unexamined is whether they are still sufficient. Life changes conditions constantly. Energy shifts, responsibilities evolve. The external world transforms. But internal structures are slower to update. They prefer continuity. the mind does not revisit old conclusions unless forced to, and in the absence of crisis, there is rarely a force strong enough. So outdated assumptions remain in place. They shape decisions quietly. They filter possibilities automatically. They narrow the future before it is consciously considered. And because this process feels orderly, it is rarely questioned. Disorder draws attention. Order fades into the background. A shrinking life often feels calm precisely because it has removed variables. Less variability means fewer surprises. Fewer surprises mean fewer emotional spikes. Fewer spikes mean a sense of control. But control is not the same as vitality. Vitality requires exposure to the unknown. It requires situations that are not fully managed. It requires moments where outcomes are uncertain. Stillness minimizes these moments, not out of fear, but out of habit. Habits form in response to repeated success. If a structure has worked for long enough, the mind begins to defend it automatically. Questioning it feels like sabotage. This is why people resist change even when they cannot articulate what they are protecting. They are not protecting happiness, they are protecting coherence, a life that makes sense to itself, even if that sense is based on outdated constraints. This resistance is not stubbornness, it is conservation. The mind conserves energy by keeping familiar patterns intact. Breaking a pattern requires attention. Attention requires effort. Effort feels costly when returns are uncertain. So the safest option is to continue. And continuing rarely feels like a decision. It feels like momentum. Days accumulate, years stack quietly, and the shape of life solidifies. At some point, the narrowing becomes noticeable, not as pain, but as absence. There are fewer moments of immersion, fewer experiences that stretch perception, fewer occasions where time seems to slow down. Life feels faster, not fuller, just faster. This is when people often begin to sense something unnamed, not dissatisfaction, not regret, just a vague awareness that time is moving differently now. And without understanding why, they attribute it to age. Age becomes the explanation for everything that has quietly contracted. But age is often blamed for processes that began much earlier, processes that had nothing to do with years passing and everything to do with attention narrowing. A life that shrinks does not announce itself. It does not argue. It does not resist. It simply continues, efficiently, quietly, predictably. And because it works, it is rarely examined. One of the reasons a shrinking life is so difficult to interrupt is simple. There is nothing obvious to fix. Most people are trained to respond to problems, clear problems, defined failures, situations where something is visibly wrong. A broken system invites attention. A crisis demands response. Pain forces presence. But a life that is shrinking offers none of these signals. It functions. It is protected. And a shrinking life often produces exactly what it promises: predictability, manageability, control. The cost is subtle. It is paid not in failure, but in reduced depth. Depth requires friction. It requires moments where systems do not immediately provide answers, where routines are insufficient, where awareness has to stretch. But when life is carefully organized to avoid these moments, depth becomes rare. Not absent, just infrequent. And infrequency is easy to normalize. People tell themselves they are simply busy, that this phase is temporary, that things will open up later. Later becomes a useful container. It holds everything that doesn't fit into the present structure. Curiosity is placed there. Exploration is postponed there. unexamined questions are stored there. Later is not a decision. It is a delay. And delays, repeated often enough, quietly become conclusions. At some point, the idea of revisiting the larger questions feels indulgent. Questions like, is this still the right shape for my life? Is this structure supporting growth or merely maintaining order? Have I been optimizing something that no longer deserves optimization? These questions don't feel dangerous. They feel inconvenient. They interrupt flow. They slow momentum. They introduce ambiguity. And ambiguity is precisely what a well-managed life tries to minimize. So the questions remain unasked, not because they are unimportant, but because they are not urgent. Urgency governs attention. Without urgency, attention drifts to what is immediate and manageable: tasks, logistics, maintenance. Life becomes a series of adjustments rather than explorations. Small improvements replace large inquiries. Efficiency replaces direction, and direction is rarely missed until it is gone. This is why many people reach a point later in life where nothing is technically wrong, yet something feels absent. They have done what was required. They have built something functional. They have avoided obvious mistakes. And yet, when they pause long enough to notice, there is a sense that the terrain has flattened. There are fewer peaks, fewer valleys, less variation. Life feels smooth. Smoothness can be comforting, but it can also be numbing. When experience becomes too consistent, perception dulls. Time compresses. Weeks pass without distinction. This is not because life is empty. It is because it has become too familiar. Familiarity reduces contrast, and contrast is what makes moments stand out. Without contrast, memory thins. People often describe this as time speeding up, years feeling shorter than they used to, moments blurring together. But time itself has not changed. Attention has. A shrinking life trains attention to stay within narrow boundaries, to notice only what is necessary for continuity, to ignore what does not serve immediate function. And over time, this mode becomes default. Awareness narrows to match the life that contains it. There is a quiet irony here. The very structures that once provided freedom can eventually limit the capacity to feel alive within them, not because they are wrong, but because they have not been re-examined. What was once a solution becomes a constraint when it is no longer questioned. And yet, questioning feels risky. Not because answers would be catastrophic, but because asking would disrupt the sense of order that has been carefully built. So people wait. They wait for a sign. They wait for a problem. They wait for something to break. But a shrinking life rarely breaks. It just becomes smaller, quietly, efficiently, without complaint. And because nothing demands intervention, most people continue living inside structures that no longer expand with them. They don't feel trapped, they feel settled. And settlement, when unexamined, can be one of the most effective forms of limitation. EP1, Part 5. A life does not announce when it has reached its final shape. There is no moment of confirmation, no signal that says, "This is it now." Most lives simply continue. They continue because continuation is easy, because systems are already in place, because stopping to look feels unnecessary. And perhaps that is the quietest danger. Not that life becomes unbearable, but that it becomes unquestioned. A shrinking life does not ask for attention. It does not demand repair. It does not create urgency. It simply asks to be maintained. Maintenance feels responsible. Maintenance feels adult. Maintenance feels safe. So people maintain. They maintain schedules. They maintain roles. They maintain versions of themselves that still function. And because they function, they are rarely examined. But functioning is not the same as living. Living has texture. It has variation. It has moments that resist efficiency. Maintenance smooths those edges away, not all at once, gradually, until life feels easier to manage and harder to feel. This transition is subtle enough to escape notice. There is no grief attached to it, no clear sense of loss, only a quiet absence, an absence of stretch, an absence of surprise, an absence of moments that interrupt the familiar rhythm. And absence is difficult to mourn when nothing was taken away. It was simply left behind. People often say they don't have time anymore, but time is not what disappeared. Attention did. Attention narrowed to fit a smaller space. A space designed for continuity, not expansion. And within that space, life continues to work. Days pass, responsibilities remain intact. The structure holds. From the outside, there is no problem to solve. From the inside, there is often nothing loud enough to hear. Just a quiet sense that time is moving differently now, that years feel shorter, that moments pass without leaving much behind. This is rarely dramatic enough to confront, so it is explained away as age, as realism, as maturity. And perhaps sometimes it is. But sometimes it is simply the result of a life that has stopped being questioned, not because questioning is dangerous, but because it feels unnecessary. And unnecessary things are easy to postpone. Until postponement becomes permanent, a shrinking life does not ask to be escaped. It does not demand to be fixed. It simply waits. It waits for attention that may or may not return. It waits for a pause long enough to notice what has narrowed. It waits without pressure. And because it waits so patiently, most people never notice when they stop expanding. They continue, quietly, efficiently, within familiar boundaries. And the thought does not end. It just rests there.